let everybody know, we're giving Commissioner Brown a couple of minutes. He's supposed to be here and he's running late. If he's not here in a couple of minutes, we're going to proceed anyway. Welcome to the January 31st, 2018 special call meeting. Do I have approval of the agenda?
Second.
Got a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 We didn't have this. Would you allow for discussion on that motion? We normally call for discussion.
We don't normally call for discussion on approval, but we can have discussion if you want to have discussion.
Okay, I think this meeting's totally unnecessary, and I'd just like to have that on the record. Thank you.
So we need to vote again?
If you would, I'd like to do it formally.
Okay. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none. This agenda is concerning commissioners' access to personnel files. That's all it's on the agenda, and we're going to limit the talk.
Are you saying you're going to censor discussion? Is that what you're saying?
No, I say I'm going to limit the talk to this topic.
I think
This is what's on the agenda.
we're allowed to say whatever's on our mind, right? Isn't that
As
freedom
long
of
as it
expression?
pertains to this agenda item. This is
What-
this is my meeting. I chair it.
Can
and
you
I'm gonna control
can
it.
you define the bounds of what would apply to this agenda item? How far out can we go? I'd like to know before we get started. How far?
We can't. We can discuss commissioners' access only. Nothing
That's all
about.
we can discuss.
That's all we can discuss.
We can't discuss what brought this meeting about?
No.
Oh, give me a break. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous.
If
I'm
if you want to make
going to
that
say it
discussion,
anyway.
put
I'm
it
going
on
to
the
say it
agenda item.
anyway. Go ahead. Let's have the meeting. That's ridiculous.
Well, you can say
That's
ridiculous.
censorship.
You can say what you want. First item consideration is Vice Chair Randy Ojino's request to address access to personnel files by members of the Board of the Commissioners. I brought this item here and I reference the policies. I don't think we can pick and choose which policies we follow, or I don't think we should. We have 108 policies. Some of them pertain to P cards, county vehicles, and such. And so I'm going to move that we, as a board, approve the Board of Commissioners follow all 108 policies, and that we let the attorney look, make sure there's no conflicts with the policy pertaining to access to personal files. And he can bring that back to us later, but until then, we are to follow the policy that's at hand.
This would apply to the county administrator as well?
I'm
we
saying
that the
county-
policies?
We're
are we-
only talking about county commissioners.
Oh, we are. We're only talking county. So are we saying that policies and procedures do or don't apply to the county administrator? Just for the
That's
record.
another,
So we don't know
well, that's another
whether they
subject.
apply or not? Is that the problem?
That's another subject. If
I'm
you
asking.
want to put that on the agenda item as another subject, we'll discuss it.
I'd ask
We're
you
not-
to, I'd ask you to, as a friendly amendment, just to include the county administrator in your motion.
I'm not going to make that motion. I don't know what, I got to look in to see what,
So no
His
accountability,
contract
no
says.
accountability for the county administrator?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. I think you've made a motion that hasn't been properly seconded. If it is seconded, then we can have some discussion.
Yep. I will not second that.
Second.
I got a motion and a second, open for discussion. I would just say that as a member of the Board of Commissioners, I would rather see us lead by example than set up policies that don't apply to us. We shouldn't be exempt from these policies. There's things in those policies and there's procedures, and this is in no way to be construed to limit access to information in personal files. There is a process to get that information. And I just want that we follow the policy.
I had a heart-to-heart talk with Chairman Maxwell yesterday on the phone. He was in the hospital. I didn't know he was, and I hated to call him when I found out he was in the hospital, but he's recovering from a minor surgery and it's nothing serious. But he admitted to me that he actually did have some knowledge of what was going on in the 911 call center.
That's outside the
And Commissioner
issue.
and Vice Chairman, I'm going to ask you, did you have knowledge of what was going on? Did someone from staff tell you what was going on?
I don't recall that I had any knowledge. I don't know at what point I had knowledge. I know I have knowledge now. I don't know at what point I had knowledge.
Excuse me, Mr.
And this
Chairman.
is outside the scope.
We've made a motion on an item to vote on. We should be discussing that item.
Okay. Well, I'll read a statement because I'll be brief that way. In government, you have officials and top-ranking staff who attempt to shape government in their own image. And sometimes that image is a poor reflection on government itself. I'm not going to be intimidated from doing my job of representing the best interests of our citizens and promoting an open and fair government. I have always and will continue to deliver pertinent government documents that are applicable to state open records law, to our citizens, the news media, and anyone else who may desire a copy. As for this abruptly called special meeting, every elected official in Georgia is properly instructed about open meetings and open records law through mandated newly elected officials training and ACCG certification classes. The fact that we actually paid an attorney to explain open records law after our taxpayers have spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for us to sit in training classes and have it explained to us is inexcusable. We either have members swimming in a pool of ignorance or purposefully attempting to obstruct the news media from gaining access to documents reflecting government misconduct. Everything I did was in accordance with state law. The attorney's opinion and all the training we have received confirm this. I have had to deal with Commissioner Otto's demands to censor my letters to the editor in the past, and I said no. I suggest consulting the Georgia First Amendment Foundation for further education. I'm going to tell Vice Chairman Agino and Commissioner Otto today that I am not going to give in on your attempts to intimidate and deflect regarding what is going on behind the scenes in government. This meeting today is nothing but an attempt to further obstruct the effort to get information out to the public regarding situations that every taxpayer needs to know. The average person has no idea just how difficult it is to be an honest person trying to promote honesty in government. All I can do is speculate as to why critical information related to our local government is withheld from people like Commissioner Rousseau and myself. My speculation is there is a deep-seated fear the two of us will not stand still and let the abuse happen, and we are not afraid to demand transparency and an unprejudiced, objective resolution. Uninhibited power in government at all levels is the breeding agent for corruption and abuse. Nothing kills our Republican democracies like uninhibited power and the lack of accountability. I have distributed to everyone in the media here, and I have copies. If you would like to see these, I would love for you to come pick one up. I have distributed to everyone here. You all have this. That's the document that I gave you. Two government documents entitled Employee Notice. They are the same form, but are for two different employees. One form labeled, and I personally labeled these, FC Human Resources, is a document that meets all criteria under open records law and has been distributed for open records requests by Human Resources and the county clerk's office numerous times. I applaud both departments for adhering to the state law and doing your duty accordingly. The second document, labeled Steve Brown, is also a document that meets all criteria under the open records law, and I distributed it publicly. There is no difference. Both documents are publicly eligible, and both are acknowledgments of some of the horrendous behavior that our employees have had to endure, behavior and other actions that were purposely withheld from some of the commissioners. I am deeply concerned that we have government officials actively engaged in cover-ups of government abuse. We can prove that vital information has been purposefully withheld from certain county commissioners, the highest ranking officials in the county government, the ones who have equal authority and responsibility, all of whom must receive equal communication from the county administrator. No more selective justice in Fayette County, no more obstruction, and no more dereliction of duties. All commissioners must have access to government communication and records. We must be able to express ourselves without fear of retribution. And I will say, just for the record, I am wondering why the one that's marked Steve Brown wasn't given out when open records requests were made for what was going on in the 911 call center, what I call crisis. Why was that document withheld? And why did Steve Brown have to go to the Human Resources Department and ask to see if there was such a document that existed in the employee file? Serious question, ladies and gentlemen, serious question. You gonna promote transparency in government? Go read the thing posted on the back wall right there. That's a value statement that I wrote in 2013, and we voted on it every year since then. And both Commissioner Rousseau and I have expressed grave concerns of whether we are adhering to that or not. Because one of the things is show honesty and integrity. The other one is treat everyone like you'd like to be treated. I'm telling you, the stuff that I've read that those employees had to endure, I would not want to be treated that way. It was inexcusable, and it should be publicly acknowledged. And as I said, anyone who wants a copy of this document is more than willing to get one. I don't know why the policies and procedures of this county don't apply to the county administrator. Darn good question. Why? It's been documented that they don't from the county administrator.
Well,
Why does he have a higher level of executive execution than the top 5 elected officials of the county government? I can't get that. Does he have a boss? I don't know. Does he? Or maybe he's our boss. Maybe that's why we're having the meeting today.
that's outside the item on the list. I will say that this was not to limit, this meeting has nothing about limiting access to information in those personnel files. There's a process in the policies on how to get that information. This access to files, we give our HR department the responsibility to make sure certain information in those files are confidential. There's a process that needs to be gone through. The open records is that process to make sure certain information is redacted and not accidentally out to the public. There's also another issue when accessing files is make sure nothing gets added to those files. That's highly wrong. It don't matter whether it's a Post-it note or what it is. Things should not get added to personnel files unless it's through the HR department in the proper procedures. It also concerns me when we have somebody accessing the files and they're in a room, might be in a room by themselves. Because with technology the way it is, it would be very easy for somebody to take pictures with their cell phone or something of documents. We don't know. But these are the issues that our HR director has to deal with. And have somebody go up and instruct somebody in HR to let him see the files, I mean, that's kind of intimidating, I'm sure, for that employee. These are not good situations. Like I said, we need to lead by example. We have a policy. We need to follow it. We need to hold ourselves to the same standard as we want to hold everybody else to. Why wouldn't we? I mean, we wrote the policy. I mean, I hear all the time about the health law, and our Congress don't have to abide by it. Well, that's wrong. I mean, if you're going to put something out there, you need to be willing to abide by it. And I'm willing to abide by it.
I wish the county administrator would abide by our stuff. But again, if you're worried about somebody taking a photograph of a record, any supervisor, any department head, any commissioner, anybody who has access to records can take a photograph of a file. It don't matter what the policy is, correct? No. Correct. And if you look at the county attorney's opinion, I followed the law to the letter. I'm tired of the deflection. I'm tired of the intimidating tactics. And we're going to set them out. All the documents are going out. We're going to have a river of documents. And I'm going to do it just whatever way you tell me. We're going to get them all out there. And people are going to know what their government is doing. I don't care. You will not intimidate me.
I'm not trying to intimidate you. I'm trying to tell you you didn't follow policy.
No. Then why are we having a vote saying we have to follow policy? Why are we having a vote?
You didn't follow it.
No.
We need that vote.
Why are we having a vote that says we have to follow policy? Do we not have to follow policy now?
Evidently you don't. You
Whoa,
think you're above
then
it.
I didn't do anything wrong. Joke. That's why we're having a vote, right? Because now you're changing the rules.
I'm not
We're changing the
rules.
rules as
We've
we
had
go.
these set of policies since you were chairman.
Then-
You helped make these policies.
Then why are we having a vote saying we got to follow them? Why is that necessary?
Because evidently you don't understand that you're supposed to follow them.
We have to have a vote?
I'm going to call for the vote. You have a discussion?
Go ahead, Commissioner.
We need to be very
But
careful.
I will want to say something.
I'm sorry?
I will want to say something.
Oh,
when we
okay.
finish.
I was just going to say we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful because this is a complicated matter. My colleague has somewhat of a valid point when he talks about if we follow the rules at the highest level, everybody under us should as well. That's legit. The other part of the equation is before we just say follow the rules, there do need to be some parameters. Example, which was thrown out already. That example might be that when you go in to review personnel files, and that's what we're dealing with here, that you're not allowed to take an electronic device. I know you put in your motion that some things need to be fleshed out, hammered out. That's probably the wise and prudent way to go, and I would, for one, like to see some recommendations made with some specific steps and standards if we're going to go this route, We have entered into a organizational crisis of some sort. And crisis might be a strong word for some and not for others. We do have tremendous latitude as elected officials, as outlined in the county attorney's memorandum. But with that, as with anything else, as leaders, it comes with a high degree of responsibility. Responsibilities in terms of how we conduct ourselves. I, for one, want to be very, very careful because at the highest level, elected officials of this organization, we sometimes may need to access information, but there's a procedure for that as well. What we're trying to do, I think, here today is obviously prevent matters from, or any of us from acting irresponsibly or rogue, if you will. I'll use that term. We need to have those safeguards in place. I'm very concerned when we talk about negotiating a common space, which is what we're doing here. Common among us, the people that work with and for us, if you want to use that term, staff, organizations, it's a common space. How do we function appropriately so that we reach the ultimate goal? And that ultimate goal is to provide a service to the public. That's what we're here for. And when we break down, our organization has an opportunity to break down. Whether or not they agree with us or whatever, they take this back into they take it into their personhood. Need to be careful that we're not jumping at some reaction. I was going to say knee-jerk. It's not. We have a very serious issue that we've been confronted with. How best to go about it, I think we need to be deliberate, take some time, and bring these things in a systematic fashion, whether it's Dennis, whether it's outside counsel who is adept and extremely versed in HR, Lewis, and I think the organization you belong to was SHRM. There's some best practices out there. But as we've discovered, or I've discovered in my time here with this body, we can have all the rules we want to have. If there's no repercussions for acting outside of those rules, then they're not worth the paper, we've all heard that it's written on. What are the repercussions when people act outside of the realm of policy and procedures? We're a pretty powerful body. There's not a whole lot that people can say to us. You can say a whole bunch of things, but do to us. But we've got to have a personal commitment. And that comes, I think, the illustrious First Lady, former First Lady, said it best, and it just comes to mind. Sitting in the seat does not make you who you are before you sit in the seat. It just reveals who you are. You are already that before you sit in that seat of power, that seat of influence, that seat of leadership. If we don't have some meaningful punishment, if you will, for acting outside the bounds of policy, then we're just writing stuff on a piece of paper. I do agree with my colleague, Commissioner Brown, that if we're going to hold ourselves to the county policy, it is reasonable, it is wise, it is prudent to also have everybody else under us, and two people are under us, unless I'm missing something. That's county administrator and the county attorney. But we need to be careful. Why do we need to be careful, Commissioner Russo? Well, I'm glad you asked. We need to be careful because the county manager has a contract, and it is different than the policies associated with this booklet. And so why I say we should step back and be careful about where we're stepping, we need to be careful because we may want to revise the county administrator's contract. So I've been advised that he doesn't necessarily fall up under the strict guidelines and limits of our policy booklet. So we need to be careful before we just say, yes, we're going to abide by it, as we should, and then say no for an employee that under contract that works for us. So unless I'm missing something, those are my thoughts, and my thoughts are surrounded around being deliberate, being wise, being prudent before we just jump. There's some ramifications, if I'm not mistaken. You can weigh in, Mr. County Attorney, on my comments. There's some ramifications that we just, when we put this in place, it has some implications and ramifications for some other stuff. Unintended consequences, I think people may call it at times. Am I correct in that assessment?
Yes, you're correct, Mr. Commissioner.
Okay. And so I would say to Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and my colleagues, while we do have an issue that warrants attention at our doorstep, and it needs to be addressed, granted, I would just say to us, let's get some things written down, anticipate those unintended consequences, and then come back to view this matter in a more comprehensive fashion. Because I can't say we're going to follow something and then have an employee who's under us not follow the same things or be held accountable. It's tricky. And so those are my comments for right now, Mr. Vice Chair and my colleagues, that I'm prepared to vote in favor of instructing staff and the county attorney to come back with some recommendations so that we're thinking in terms of all of the potential openings, that we're closing those doors before we just make a blanket statement. We have a crisis, people. We're trying to deal with it as openly, honestly, and fairly as we possibly can. And so those are my comments for right now. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, my colleagues.
Mr. Chair, just some brief comments, and I generally appreciate your comments, Commissioner Russo. And I'm just going to start by a totally unrelated subject, but I'm going to say make no apologies for my time as the chairman. I was taking over at a time when there were some hurt feelings, and they've carried through to today, I believe. But I make no apologies. I did the best I could, and we accomplished some very fine things. Never censored, none of that. We're here today not to talk about staff, not to talk about issues. The only item here was whether or not commissioners should have unfettered access to personnel files. That doesn't seem to be a difficult issue for me. There's a lot of folks out here who aren't members or employees of this county, and I would dare say that they have personnel files as well, wherever they work. And I would dare say that they would be pretty surprised to find out that anybody at any time, for any reason, go into their file without their knowledge and look for information. And so all I'm saying is I don't think that as commissioners, especially as commissioners, that we should have any right or any privilege to go into a file unfettered without anyone's knowledge to look for information that we can use. This is confidential, could be legally confidential. I think the item here is to lay out the ground rules for this. I have no heartburn over looking at it and coming up with procedures that allow commissioners, just like anybody else, to go through a process and look for information they feel is important. So that being the case, I don't have a problem with this either, but I'm a little surprised at why there is such heartburn over this. This is fine to me. It makes sense. We should be leading by example, and we should not be doing anything that we don't expect anyone else to do. We are the leaders here, supposedly, and we need to act that way. So those are my comments.
I'd like to counter that the state gives us that authority, the state open records law. It gives every supervisor, it gives every department head the ability to go do that. The case law has been proven that you can do this. Now, in terms of that information is confidential, no, it's not. There are certain things that are exempt from open records. Those things are clearly delineated in the attorney's opinion. The documents that I have and the documents that I've given to the press, and if you all want to see them, have none of that exempted material in those forms. If you want to keep the elected officials, the people that are in charge of representing the interest of the citizens, the head of the department of whatever is not in charge of necessarily representing the direct interests of the citizens. The elected officials are. If you want to somehow obstruct their ability to look at government documents, then we're in trouble. We're in trouble. I don't have any problem with, if you want to say I got to wipe my feet off and put my phone in a bag before I look at a record, that's fine. Because let me tell you what happened. I couldn't find the record that I was asking for from Human Resources in the pile they gave me. That should worry you, brother. That should worry you. And guess what I had to do? I had to go up to Human Resources to see if that file existed. I went up, I asked for Lewis Patterson, he was out. I asked the nice lady, may I see this file? I would like to see if there's something in there. She said, certainly. She walked over, she handed me the file. I asked her, where would you like me to view the file? Do you have somewhere where I can sit down and view the file? She said, you can do that desk over there. I said, absolutely. I sat down at that desk. I opened the file, and lo and behold, there was the document that wasn't in the Human Resources batch that was subject to the open records request. I asked her, can you make 5 copies of this, please? She said, certainly. I handed her the document. She made 5 copies. I took one of those copies. I wrote, I have taken 4 copies of this form with me. Steve Brown signed it, and I put the date on the back of it. I asked her if she could insert that in the file. Just publicly, professionally, doing the right thing, somebody would know I accessed that record. Now, if we're going to say this type of behavior is wrong, and that searching out for documents that weren't released is wrong, especially documents that have the information on them that this one has, that the taxpayers have a right to see, if we're going to say that is wrong, let's all go home. We don't need a government anymore. We'll let the Gestapo run the show. There's no need for us, because that's our job. We represent the people of Fayette County. We represent them now in individual districts. That's great, but you better make sure your people can trust you. You better make sure that when nasty things are going on in government, when women in our road crew are being told they got to defecate behind trees, and they have to stand out there with signs for 10 to 12 hours at a time without a break, you better hope your elected officials are going to stand up and say, that ain't right, because it's happened in Fayette County. And when you've got people in a department that feel so harassed that they've had to call law enforcement, that ain't right.
Let's stick to the topic.
I am talking about the topic. We all better have access to these documents. Our policies and our ordinances do not supersede state law. And if you're going to tell me right now that they do supersede state law, please put it on the record, because they don't. And I have access to every one of those records. I have no inhibitions whatsoever about going and looking at records. That's my job. That's why I got elected. That's why people checked my name on the ballot, to be their representative, to make sure the government is on the up and up. And let me tell you, as my colleague Commissioner Russo said, we got a crisis on our hands because there are some things that aren't going well. And there's a list of them, and we're going to go over that list in coming meetings.
You just admitted that you added something to a personal record.
Absolutely I did. I did it as a professional addition.
That's illegal. I mean, that's not right. You've got no right to add anything to that personnel file.
Okay.
Would you like the attorney to address that?
If you want somebody to publicly acknowledge that they accessed a record, if that's criminal behavior, put the cuffs on me. I'm ready to go to jail. Put the cuffs on me.
You added stuff to a personnel file.
If you
That's
want me,
not right.
if acknowledging that I accessed a personal record in a professional manner is a crime, put the cuffs on me. Send me to jail.
Mr. Chairman, I call a vote. We've discussed this.
Well, I need to make reference to a citizen's letter that sent. from Dawn C. Oprah, Fayette County resident. It says, "My dear county commissioners, I'd like to come this afternoon to deliver my remark in person, but the call of nature of my meeting, of this meeting, I could not get out of my previous planned engagement. However, because the seriousness nature of what is to be discussed on the agenda, I felt compelled to put in writing my thoughts and concerns as a citizen for public record. In my preparation for making remarks, I spoke with one of the newer school board members to ascertain what their practices were pertaining to individual gaining access to personnel file of school board employees. He said they could not, as individual, look at personnel files of any employee. He recommended I talk with the HR director regarding specific policy. I called and spoke to the HR director and she shared with me why the board members could not individually ask for and gain access to an individual employee personnel file. It had a great deal to do with privacy and rules and laws. If there is a reason for board members to see personnel files because of pending situation, it is done with staff. And as a board, and generally the school board attorney, it is called, the school board attorney is called to advise. She did, however, say an employee can give permission for someone to see their personnel file. And if files are court subpoenaed, that can be shared with the school board's attorney about what would need to be redacted. She also referred me to the website about best practices for managing confidential records that stated the following: confidential files. You should always treat personnel files just like any other private documents within the company. Normally, personnel records are kept within locked file cabinet that only certain people have access to. You should make sure that these files are only available to the people that have legitimate and valid reason to look at the files. As a suggestion, you may want to set up a company policy that the only people that are allowed to access an employee personnel record are the human resource manager, the employee supervisor or manager, and the employee himself. By setting up such a policy, you will protect the confidentiality of these files, your employee privacy, and also limit the opportunities for false documents to get into the files. In addition, by having a policy in place, you have the right to discipline anyone that breaks the policy. Since, like everything else these days, employee personnel files are likely to be available in electronic form, your policy should also address who has access to the databases. Where employee records are kept, you should limit electronic access to those people and groups listed above. I then called the county manager and asked him to send me a copy of the current county policy on how they handle discipline and grievances, which he did. I also called the county commissioner and asked a few questions to help understand how far the role of county commissioner goes. He explained that the Board of Commissioners has the right to see any record in the county, including personal records. While I agree with the right to review and see all records, I think how the right is exercised is very important for the protection and integrity of the Board of Commissioners individually and collectively, as to avoid risk and liability. I believe there should be written policy in place that states the circumstances under which the Board of Commissioners may gain access to personal records. I think if it is important enough for the board member to review a personal file, that the whole Board of Commissioners should be informed and jointly agree that an investigation is merited. I don't think any one Board of Commission members should be allowed to unilaterally decide to look at personnel file of an employee. It erodes the trust we put in the process that is in place for staff to handle personnel matters. It crosses the line of authority. It also sets up potential liability that could incur a lawsuit should an individual run foul of proper procedures. I think such a written policy is for the protection of the Board of Commissioners, employees, the managing staff, and the citizens of Fayette County at large. Thank you so much. Very respectfully submitted, Don Oprah. I think she pretty much covered it.
And while I admire Ms. Opara, she wanted us to violate state law on about 5 different occasions in that letter. And if you want to say that one person with a vested interest being elected from the citizens can't look at government documents because a majority says they can't, then you have thrown democracy out the window, and you have thrown transparent government out the window, and you have created the rule of the oppressors. And if you don't want access to government documents, and you don't want your personnel file viewed, don't work in government, because it's the law. You can look at it with certain exemptions: birth date, social security number, medical information, and a few other things. Those would be redacted. If you don't want the other information in the public, don't work for the government, period. Because it's the state law. And if you're going to tell me that I've got to come up with a legitimate and valid reason to look at a government record, then who is going to be the arbiter of what is legitimate and what is valid? Because I got elected to look into those documents and to make sure that we're running an efficient ship that's above board and run well. If you want to violate state law and throw the state law out the window, then I suggest you write something to your local legislative person and tell them to revoke the open records law. I'm sure that would go over well with the citizens.
I'd just like to make one comment. I'm sorry. We are not asking that commissioners cannot see government documents. Let's clarify it. We are talking about personnel items here.
Those are government files.
Some of which are sensitive and are not permitted, and the process requires that we have somebody look at them and redact them before we become the arbiter of what can go out or not go out. And that's a very simple and very honest and very professional request, which is why I don't understand the heartburn. So let's understand, government documents, everyone has access to them. There's some issues that we don't have access to, and we are not the ones that should be making that call.
Mr. Otto, I will tell you that the arbiter of what a document can leave this building is the state law of Georgia, the State Open Records Act. That is the arbiter. It is not anybody on this dais. I can assure you, we have no control over what leaves this room. It is subject to state judicial authority, not us. And if you want that power, then I'm sorry, you don't have it. Go run for the state legislature or go be the governor. Maybe you can get that changed. That is the arbiter of what can leave in terms of a record of this building. None of us.
Mr. Chair, my colleagues, I unfortunately have some other comments, not to belabor the point. We're dancing around the issue of separations of powers. This is our government lesson for the day, not that you all need it, but there's a reason there's a separation. And it's a safeguard, whether it's the executive, legislative, or the judicial branches. And those safeguards are in place so that we don't act independently on our own wishes and whims. And so I'm asking my colleagues today is to allow the appropriate individuals, and while I have some background in many areas, I'm not an expert except in one or two, or consider myself expert. Probably be some objections from people if I said that, which ones they were, but Dennis does to a certain degree, Lewis does to a certain degree, and they have access to things. And I would caution so we don't make a decision that runs into those separations, that we really instruct staff today to go back and bring us some things to talk about how we safeguard abuse of our right and freedoms to information, and to some degree, as you said, my colleague, our responsibility to have access. I don't want to limit that. We need to be very careful. So I would really like for us to, instead of making a blanket policy here, really look at the ramifications and come back and weigh these things on what's the best way to do that. It may be, as my colleague Commissioner Otto said, it may be that we do want to have some knowledge among the board so that we're not operating independently. We do everything else with a simple majority vote. It may be. I'm just saying those things need to be weighed very carefully before we proceed. So our functions and duties are different at each level. Ours is the ultimate at this level. We set policy that dictates how people carry out their day-to-day operations. Let's not trample over that in our haste to correct an issue that really raises a red flag. How we go about doing that. Not that it's permissible, it's how we should do it, and that we all agree that that's a reason, well, a simple majority of us agree that it is the proper way to go forward. So I really would say to my colleagues, encourage us, and I'm prepared to vote. And if not, I'd like to make that substitute motion if it doesn't pass, that we instruct staff to come back with some parameters or legal implications around making this a policy. Because I do have a problem that if we adopt that we have to follow it, our contract employees do as well. So do vendors who come on our property. All of those things has to be taken into consideration. Contractors, vendors, suppliers, issues like sexual harassment, all that. That's in our procurement policies and things of that nature, but we just need to be careful of what we set up, that it's enforceable. Thank you very much.
And I will say one last thing. Hearing our discussion and hearing what's coming out, I am very glad we've had this meeting, because I think the video of this meeting is going to be fodder for every civics class at every college and university in the state and every high school. There's going to be more discussion on open records and open speech and freedom of expression. I hope it does. And I will personally send it to them just to see it. But these are issues that, you know, like I said, I don't even know why we were having this meeting after we had the attorney's opinion. The attorney's opinion was very clear of what the law requires and what you had to do to follow the law. But I think this is going to be great fodder for our students, and I hope it fosters a continued discussion.
I would say, he keeps mentioning open records. That's a very important factor here. But I know that if I viewed a personnel file and wanted to take a copy, I'm not trained in what to redact or not to redact. So, and I'm sure Commissioner Brown will say he's trained in it, because he copied something and took it out there and now has made public record out of it without going through the process of the open records that he keeps bringing up. I mean, there's a process. And it just saddens me. And I look at the attorney's opinion. Well, guess what, folks? I have the county organizational chart. Guess who's at the top of that chart? It's the citizens. Should they have access to those files
Yes.
without redaction? No.
According to state law, they should have absolute access according to state law, which is.
Through the
which is-
open
Which
records.
is the entire file.
Point of
except
order,
for
Mr. Chairman.
items.
He has the floor.
I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Flo. Point of order.
They cannot have access to those unless they go through the open records request. This is just, it really saddens me that we sit here and it's to think that we could possibly vote against following our own policies. I mean, what kind of leadership is that? We need to be the leaders that follow our policy. If there's something in there that we don't agree with, we need to bring them up and change them. But if we can't vote as a unit to follow the very policies, and I'll make note, these policies have been in effect for 5 years now, except for some minor changes, and we've always followed them, just without a vote. And it's sad that we have to get to this point that we need a vote. I mean, but now you have somebody that don't follow the policies, and we need to make sure that it's on record that we're willing to follow these policies. I have no problem with the attorney and the HR director bringing back recommendations or us looking at the contract to make sure that the administrator is to follow these policies. I've got no problems with looking at it. But I do have a problem if we're not willing to vote that we will follow the very policies that we expect the rest of everyone else to follow. I have a big problem with that.
And I would just say, I agree with Commissioner Russo. I like your tactics a lot better than the motion that was made. I think that's something that we should do. I've read the policy again. There's nothing in that policy that I didn't follow. So, I mean, if you want to pass the policy again, let's pass the policy again. There's nothing in that policy that I didn't follow.
Well, you have no reason to vote against it then.
I went to Human Resources Department and no, I agree with Commissioner Russo. I think if we're going to say this, it needs to be, I've asked you to amend your motion to include the county administrator and everyone else who's under our charge. If you don't do that, I will not vote for it
I
because.
cannot amend that motion because that is a separate contract. He's a contract employee.
No.
It has to be in his contract.
Make the motion right now.
I cannot amend it.
If I could, I have followed those policies since day one. I am shocked to say that anyone thinks that I've not followed those policies. So I have no problem amending my contract. I've always followed those policies. As a matter of fact, the first time it ever came to light that I wasn't subject to those policies was when I had a wreck 2 years ago. And I still subjected myself to that same policy and voluntarily disciplined myself accordingly. So I have no problem following policies. Quite frankly, I've followed for the past 5 years, if that helps any of the decision-making today.
No, I'd love to see it.
I'll amend my motion to include
Yeah.
the
Wait,
county
mi-
administrator.
Because, yeah, I need to say for the record, I also govern myself according to the policy.
Yeah.
And so.
And I did when I got that record. There's nothing in there that I violated in that policy. I followed, everything was met.
I can make an amendment.
So
I'll-
let's restate the motion so I understand what we're exactly voting.
I'll amend the motion that all county commissioners abide by the 108 policies and the county administrator, and that we have the attorney look into the unintended access of personnel files and come back with recommendations.
Or not unintended exit, or
Very much.
policies around
Policies
access
around
to.
access to personnel files.
All right.
And I would add a friendly amendment to say also to not do anything that's in conflict with state law.
Oh, yeah, it will. Dennis is bound and obligated to do
Well, I
that,
mean,
right?
I keep waiting for somebody to amend the second so we can discuss this.
I will second.
Well, he's.
Well,
Oh,
you
well,
gotta
yeah.
amend this.
Well, it's a new motion, but.
so finally, everybody has to listen to me. I amend my second.
Thank you. Yes, that is implied that state law will be followed.
It supersedes whatever
Sure.
you do.
yeah.
Call for the vote.
Call for the-
Call for the vote.
Pardon me.
Yes.
You read into the record a citizen from Fayette County. Did you want to give any other person an opportunity to speak since you
Yeah,
did that?
we can give the citizens opportunity to speak. Would anybody like to speak? Seeing none, bring it back to the board. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Got a motion and a second.
Aye.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anybody who wants